Released the report that is on the maiden budget of President William Ruto, that is financial year 2023-2024. And in it, there is, of course, a lot of content that we'll be highlighting this morning. Just to begin with a total of expenditure of 3.89 trillion Kenya shillings.
Yes.
In terms of the recurrent and development, what did you figure out?
Well, thank you very much, Chacha, for having me here. In terms of the spending, you will realize that we did not quite achieve what was planned, because what was planned was way over 4 trillion. But in terms of the funding that was available, we were able to spend the 3.9 trillion. Of course, in the various spending areas, as you have seen in the report. So I have to say that there were MDAs that did not receive full funding as of the end of the financial year, and that also is in the report. Then if you look at the CFS, the Consolidated Fund Services, also we had shortfalls, especially in the pensions and gratuities. We did well in terms of repaying the public debt. That we didn't have a problem. But you'll also observe that we have a substantial part in pending bills. These are unpaid bills by the MDAs. So there are various aspects of that report that are worth noting in terms of how we spent the money in total.
So what could be the reason that we are not able to finance all the obligations that we had initially? Could it be because of the revenue shortfall that we witnessed?
Absolutely. We had shortfalls both in the revenue collected by KRA. We also had shortfalls in the borrowing, in the budgeted borrowing. So if you go to the budgeted borrowing, you'll also observe that we did not borrow as much as we had planned, especially on the domestic front.
That, what could be the cause? Is it the market had no liquidity?
Okay, we can't really put a finger on one specific reason as to why we did not achieve the targeted revenue. There were a number of reasons, and I think that's why we need to read the report even more, because there's a lot of detail inside. Yes.
In terms of the expenditure that was there, we had 3.89 trillion as the total expenditure, and only 516 billion went into financing our development. Whereas for the recurrent expenditure, it gobbled taxpayers' money, 3.37 trillion Kenya shillings. Does it satisfy you on the amount that we allocate or that we spent on development?
Chacha, you realize that our development has not been going on as planned. And the reason for this is that after we prepare the budgets very well, we do not stick to the development targets that we have made at the beginning. We prepared various reports during the year, and the purpose of the budget implementation reports is for us to observe the trends in how the expenditure is going and weigh that against the targets that we set at the beginning, so that corrective action can be taken. I remember very well that for most part of the year, we were short on cash flows, but whatever was available was then being taken to recurrent spending, and as a result of that, we ended up with shortfalls in development targets. I think it partly also goes to fiscal discipline, because once you prepare a budget, then you must ensure that your indicators are monitored on a regular basis. Now, in spite of the reports that we give, we were a bit disappointed that every so often we are noticing that development is not up to scratch, but we would rather be traveling than doing the development aspects. So this is really a wake-up call, so that for the implementers of the budgets, they take the reports that we prepare seriously and take corrective action, not to go in the direction where development is left suffering.
And
yes.
You've also listed the top 10 spending MDAs on development expenditure, that is for the financial year 2023-2024.
Yes.
And the State Department for Roads, leads with the 78 billion Kenya shillings, followed by economic planning, transport, crop development, medical services, water and sanitation, national treasury, energy, and as well housing and urban development, and finally irrigation. In terms of the MDAs that should top this list, should we have some of the agricultural state departments leading, factoring that agriculture is considered as a backbone of this economy?
That's right, Chacha, but in terms of the way the budgets were prepared at the beginning, I don't think agriculture had the largest development budget. So I think if you went to the development and looked at it, you will find that the State Department of Roads still had the largest budget. Although we'll still say we did not spend as much as we would have liked. But agriculture, yes, it is allocated money, but also observe that agriculture is devolved, and a lot of agriculture is going on in the counties, such that at the MDA level, we are looking at policy making. And the policy making is not so much of where the development should be taking place. Perhaps when we get to the county report, you'll be seeing more of how they have put their funding into agriculture, and then we can discuss that aspect in a little more detail. Yes.
In terms of revenue generated in the financial year 2023-2024, ordinary revenue was 2.29 trillion Kenya shillings. However, we had, of course, domestic borrowing and external loans. Finance Act of 2023, which is one that also Kenyans took to the streets to demonstrate against when it was the finance bill. How much did it rake in to finance the budget?
Now, Chacha, you will observe, if you read the particular area of the report, that we raised over 2 trillion, actually 2.3 trillion in revenue from taxes. So it still remains the highest source of government funding. The other sources, as you can see, domestic borrowing only gave us just about 700 million. We also had
billion, you meant.
External loans, slightly less than the domestic loans, and non-tax revenue, which is really negligible, as well as other domestic financing. So we have really to appreciate that our highest source of government spending is tax revenue. Yes, we can't hide from that.
And now that we had 795 billion in terms of what we borrowed domestically,
yes,
and external loans of 705, that totals to about 1.4 trillion.
Yes.
Is it what we had anticipated to borrow in the first place while we had the budget passed before the supplementaries?
Not exactly. That one would need to go to the specific details, but we borrowed actually less than we had planned, especially on the domestic front. we had anticipated to borrow a little more than that. Yes.
On the ratio that has always been a problem, whether we should have a 45-55 ratio, that is for domestic and external,
yes,
or 55 and 45,
yes,
55 domestic and 45 external. This one, the impact of actually borrowing more domestically in terms of even access of loans to the MSMEs, are we not injuring our own economy?
You are right in a way, but I think I wouldn't want to give a flat answer to that. There are very many considerations that go into deciding whether we should go domestic or whether we should go foreign, and even about the whole ratio of how much should be external, how much should be internal. I would like to agree with you that if we borrow too much internally, we tend to crowd out the private sector who need these loans. We have the small and medium enterprises that also need the same funding. But we also have to look at the trends in Forex. So we always have to say, I mean, in which direction is the foreign exchange moving? So when we find that the foreign exchange in comparison to the Kenya shilling is unfavorable, then of course the fallback position is to borrow locally. But having said that, we also have to fall back on what the Central Bank of Kenya is doing in terms of the monetary policy. So this monetary policy monitors the inflation levels at all times, making sure that the planned inflation is being tracked in a sense that there shouldn't be too much money flow. So if there is too much money in the economy, you know, then there are too few goods being followed by this money. So that is inflationary. So the CBK is also trying to adjust that all the time with the monetary policy. So it is not something that we can say we should always stick to a fixed percentage in terms of internal versus external. Yeah, there are many factors that go into that. Mm-hmm. Yes. And,
you know, as of now, we have our debt stock at 10.56 trillion Kenya shillings, according to your report. Mm-hmm. And issues around the debt distress that we are, in terms of the percentage to our debt anchor, that is 55% plus or minus 5%. Mm. Perhaps at what percentage are we at, and are we really moving towards the required threshold, that is 55%? Or we are going to, you know, the other side, increasing it rather than reducing the percentages?
Yeah, and unfortunately, at the point at which this percentage was passed, we were already way past it. We were already in the 60s. Actually, we were at about 67% of the GDP. So the aim then has to be, how do we bring down that percentage to 55? It is quite a tall order. But when you look at it, then we need to be increasing our GDP as we reduce our loans, so that then that percentage can come to 55. So if we have a static GDP and the loans are increasing, arithmetically you can see that the percentage will still be unfavorable. So as it is right now, we are not in a good place as far as the percentage is concerned. Then you also know that in terms of the absolute figure, again, the figure was 10 trillion. So we are also past that. So we can't even think of going back there. So the best way out for us is to think of ways of reducing the debt while increasing the GDP. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And just, of course, in the details of the debt that we have, even as it stands at 10.56 trillion Kenya shillings, How much do we owe domestic lenders and also external lenders?
Well, just like you have said, the percentages, you just mentioned them actually. So right now, the domestic debt is slightly higher than the external debt because those figures have been growing. But the observations that we have made is that short-term domestic debt has been increasing to the detriment of longer-term domestic debt. What I mean by that is that the treasury bills, the 90 days treasury bills, are the most favored. So people like to borrow short-term. They don't want to take bonds, which will be 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years.
Does it show lack of faith?
In a way, you can say, yeah, because you know investors are rational. So they are looking at how can they benefit from the interest without the risk of default. And that indeed, as you say, shows an element of how much trust the investors have in the system.
Now that we have our domestic debt surpassing that of the external, yet our tendency in the 2023-2024 financial year has actually been we are borrowing more domestically.
Yes.
Are we even repaying these loans in the first place domestically more than externally?
Actually, we are paying all the loans. I have not seen any default so far. But perhaps what you should be asking, at what cost are we complying? And that is a very long story. I may not tell you. Because these aspects are all interconnected. So for you to pay the external debt, you must raise the money. Now, in order to raise the money, if there isn't enough from the taxes, then you must borrow locally to pay externally.
So that has happened in the
Yes.
2023-2024 financial year?
Yes, it happens all the time. So there are many ways of borrowing. One of the ways that we borrow is to take overdraft in the very short term from the CBK. You know that we are allowed to take up to 5% of the reported revenues as an overdraft. So this is to manage the cash flows. However, you may find that after we have taken the overdraft now to settle the external bills, then we also have a domestic bill to pay. So we must take more domestic debt to pay that domestic bill.
So our tendency has been we borrow to pay.
Yes, but you have to look at the nuances, you know the way it is done, and there is no one day that is like the next. Yeah, every time this challenge comes on the ground, we have to look at what options are available to us. But that is what happens. So we have not defaulted at any point, but it is at a very high cost,
On
which
the
you may
Eurobond,
also see in the report.
on the Eurobond, that was also, of course, settled, or there was a buyback.
Yeah.
The 1.5 billion
Yes.
US dollars Eurobond. On how we handled it, was it the best way?
I may not say whether it was the best way, but again, all the time we look at the circumstances and then we craft solutions based on the circumstances. So depending on where we were then, that was the best decision because we needed to pay. We needed to pay the Eurobond. And at the same time, you have seen that our rating by the international credit rating agencies has not been very good. It's been going down. And that is because they can see the struggles that we go through. trying to pay off the debt. And this is a situation that we must improve. We must start coming out of that grey list, as they call it. Yeah.
So Fitch and Moody's are
Yes.
the institutions that downgraded us.
Yes.
For this current financial year, does it mean our access to these loans will be more tough or hard compared to the previous financial year with the downgrade that we currently have?
Yes, it will be tougher in the sense that any debt that we are given is costlier. It costs us more than it did in the past. So in a sense, you are right. Yeah.
And that will mean we borrow now more domestically than externally?
Well, your guess is as good as mine. If you can't borrow externally, then of course you fall back to the domestic debt.
So with the 12.75%, that is according to the Monetary Policy Committee, that is the, of course, figures that were set. And now that we are going to focus on borrowing more domestically, are we also looking at, a possible borrowing at very high interest rates compared to the previous fiscal year? However, it was at 13%.
Yes, last year,
the CBR rate,
until the last monetary policy meeting, it was 13%. Now, this 13% has a lot around it, because when the government borrows short term, that is the overdraft that I told you about, the CBK charges that 13%. So every time that rate is passed, it sends shockwaves everywhere. It sends shockwaves within the economy, and it impacts government spending greatly. So if you look at, and I would invite you to look at the overdraft figures, you will notice that the overdraft interest that was paid, because it is charged on a daily basis, was very, very high. Then the other aspect that we were spending on was the fluctuations in foreign exchange. And in a way, the rates went down a bit. Now, when the rates went down, we paid less in terms of, the shilling got stronger, and we were paying less in terms of the forex fluctuations. But the rate at the CBK is the real decider of even the banks. The banks adjust their base rate based on that monetary policy. So when it went to 13, I can tell you hardly anyone was borrowing. Borrowing became too expensive because 13 was the base. Then you find the banks are charging 13 plus 4 plus 7, plus anything. So borrowing really became just too expensive locally.
So in terms of the projections that are now there, especially in this fiscal year, where now that we've been downgraded, we are not going to borrow, or if we borrow externally, it will be more expensive. So
Yes.
our focus shifts to the domestic one.
Yeah.
And this, Monetary Policy Committee reduced from 13% to 12.7% the CBR rate.
Yeah.
Are we likely to see it shoot up maybe to 14% or 15%? Now that the government will be more interested to borrow domestically?
I think that is something we'll be watching closely. I cannot predict in advance, but we can all see that if we are going to do more borrowing locally, the monetary, that rate, the MPC rate, may go up, and therefore that may mean even less borrowing especially from the smaller businesses.
So we are, the promise that was there while this government came into office that MSMEs will easily access credit in banks might not be fulfilled.
Well, again, I can't predict that, but let's watch. We can only see the indicators from far in terms of what is happening. But what actually happens, of course, depends on a few other things that may not be within our purview as of now.
So in solving all these in terms of loans, it's for us to generate revenue. The president has been keen, you know, of moving the figures from 14% to even 22%. Is that attainable?
It is. I'm one of those people who believes that we can raise our revenues a lot if we can get the leakages, the areas where our revenues leak. So
probably even the 2.3 trillion that we raised in form of the ordinary revenue could have been more if at all the leakages were not there.
Yes.
So who's
Absolutely.
stealing?
That's what I'm saying. I don't know.
The leakages are okay.
Okay, I'm not a thief catcher, so to say, but sometimes I can see, say, areas in terms of people who are not paying their debts, their taxes, so to say. So when I release funds, especially to the counties, I'm usually given schedules of what is to be paid, and we make sure that the tax law is followed at that point. But what we have found out is that sometimes, after I have approved those monies, they are not paid to the people that I approved for.
That is a tendency that is in counties.
Yes.
At that juncture, we take a short commercial break. When we come back, we'll be still focusing on the report by the auditor, by the Controller of Budget, rather, that is FCPA, Dr. Margaret Nyakango, even as she, of course, revealed more details of how President William Ruto's government spent its maiden budget. Keep the conversation going via social media platforms at K24 TV, at Joy Chachazolo on SMS, and WhatsApp numbers on the bottom of your screens. When we come back, we'll also be focusing on what became of austerity measures. We'll be back. Stay tuned.
Follow the champions on the home of